Okay, so hello everyone. Thank you for joining us on the first day of our symposium, Reimagining Police Surveillance. Today we have our first panel on the history and overview of police surveillance in America. We have three great speakers and our moderator, Professor Kim Thomas. Professor Kimberly Thomas's research, teaching, and practice concentrates on criminal law and criminal procedure, especially on sentencing law and practice, juvenile justice, parole and post-conviction, and indigent persons accused of crimes. Professor Thomas is also the co-founder of the Juvenile Justice Clinic here at Michigan Law, and we're really excited to have her here helping us today. So thank you, Professor Thomas. And with that, I'll let you take it away.
Thanks, Veronica. I wanted to thank the Michigan Journal of Law Reform for this amazing symposium that begins today. And today we're really going to explore a historical understanding of how police surveillance technology emerged, how police technologies have been drawn and adapted from the commercial marketplace, how the digital era has changed the landscape for criminalization. We also wanted to consider and honor and recognize Martin Luther King's legacy on MLK Day today to inquire about how our country's modern and unprecedented surveillance powers could be contextualized and understanding their use against communities of colors, religious minorities, immigrants, and dissidents in the past. I'm very excited to introduce our three panelists today who can help us inform and explore these topics. First is Andrea Dennis. She is the Associate Dean for Faculty Development in the John Byrd Martin Chair of Law at the University of Georgia School of Law. Her scholarship explores criminal defense, race and criminal justice, criminal informants, and the cradle to prison pipeline, with an emphasis on how America's historical reliance on Black informants to police and socially control Black people should inform our understanding of modern day policing practices. Welcome, Professor Dennis. Second, we have with us Matthew Guariglia, who's an affiliated scholar in the Institute of Criminal Justice at the University of California, Hastings School of Law. He also serves as a policy analyst at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, where he works on issues of surveillance and privacy at the local, state, and federal level. Thank you for joining us today. Last but not least, we have Daanika Gordon, who's an assistant professor of sociology at Tufts University. Her research explores the intersection of race, place, and the law, and her current project analyzes the relationships between racial segregation and policing to describe how police respond to and shape unequal urban landscapes. So we're so honored to have the three of you here with us today. To begin, I'm wondering if you could each help describe for us, in your view, what the impetus for police surveillance in America has been and how that surveillance has adapted over time. So I invite you, Professor Dennis, to begin.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, Kim. Thanks to the Journal for organizing this event and for inviting me to participate. I'm delighted to be here on this important day as we honor Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and we talk about this very important topic. And I especially look forward to hearing the remarks of my co-panelists and engaging in thoughtful conversation. So I think maybe as the lead off to this particular question, I want to begin back, way back, right? And generally, I would argue that police surveillance in the colonies and then later America grew out of the informer concept or system that was transplanted from England. Right, so before there were government-backed law enforcement organizations and a modern criminal legal system had been created and embedded in society. We're looking at this era when policing was communal and informal and often summary in implementation, right? So informer statutes allowed individuals to sue others for violations of penal law and recover money. Relatedly, these statutes would allow individuals who gave evidence for criminal prosecution to receive an award, right? And so this was how, before we had a formalized system of law enforcement and criminal legal process, many criminal laws, penal laws were enforced. My research has focused particularly on informing or snitching during antebellum slavery and the Black experience of police surveillance, as was mentioned. And in the course of that research, I discovered that there were many informer statutes here in the colonies and later America that were aimed at policing Blacks and maintaining slavery. So rewards could be obtained for revealing an escape or rebellion plot, right? And this reward could be obtained by a free Black person or an enslaved Black person. Rewards by statute could be obtained for revealing the possession of prohibited materials, so by Blacks, so poison or personal property, which was impermissible for Blacks, enslaved Blacks to own. And even there were informer statutes that allowed for Blacks to obtain a reward for informing on whites who had facilitated Black lawlessness in some way. Right, so there were a wide range of these informer statutes here in the colonies and later in the Americas that provided rewards. And so if we fast forward just a bit in time, once the modern institutionalized police state began to arise, about the 1830s, right, law enforcement began to take a role in the surveillance of individuals, right, that had been carried out by informers. Of course, lay citizens and others continued to be a significant tool for human surveillance. And so I think, right, historically, we can find that police surveillance is rooted, right, in our initial system of just surveillance, although by lay individuals. And then, right, we adapted to have primarily, maybe not primarily, I don't know, but police surveillance. And so just lastly, I would say, before I turn it over to my colleagues, I've observed and been most interested in thinking about sort of the adaptation or evolution in 2 dimensions. So as my remarks just suggested, right, the transition from human surveillance by lay citizens in the community or the street, so to speak, right, to human surveillance by law enforcement in the community, in the street. So that's one sort of evolution or adaptation I've been interested in. And the other is the move from community or street-based surveillance to surveillance in online spaces, particularly social media and virtual platforms. And so I'll stop there and turn it over to my colleagues.
Thank you, Professor Dennis. We have a lot to follow up on from that. Professor Guariglia, can you?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And thank you so much to everybody who helped put together this incredible event, and to my co-panelists, Professors Gordon and Dennis, for being here and letting me sit in on your remarks. In addition to my day's job studying how police technology is used every day in our contemporary moment, I'm a historian, and my research has focused specifically on how race and ethnicity in the late 19th and early 20th century really helped build and shaped the modern police department. That police look and act as they do and behave the way they do because they have been considering racial difference and ethnic difference and immigration in this period in the late 19th and early 20th century. And surveillance has always been a central aspect to these attempts at racial subordination and criminalization. Historically, police deemed surveillance necessary under kind of 2 general conditions that I think about. One is that there is a defined group of people that the state wishes to generate a body of knowledge about. And this is necessary for both subordination and for, historically, the extraction of value and labor. And you can trace this back to, lantern laws, which Simone Brown has really kind of brought back into the public discourse, in which, in colonial cities, and especially she discusses New York, people of African descent were forced to carry lanterns around with them at night to make their presence known and to make their movements very visible to people. And this is kind of a really early way to think about surveillance and subordination. And in other ways, in my forthcoming book, I look a lot about mapping tenement slums that immigrants would live in early 20th century New York, and how it became pivotal for police to map and understand these supposedly illegible spaces for the purpose of extracting rent. And this is also another kind of very historically grounded instance in which surveillance becomes a central part of understanding racialization historically. The state relies on this body of knowledge collected through surveillance in order to make possible the exercise of power. surveillance as a way of weaponizing information. And the other general condition is when heavy-handed, punitive, and unaccountable policing creates rifts, as it has since the beginning, between the state and its representatives and the people who are being policed. In other words, when police do not feel confident that a community would cooperate with investigation, or when there are other chasms like police speak a different language than the people who are being policed, that necessitated a technical solution to the human problem of how to suppress and understand a multiracial, multi-ethnic, and multilingual populace. That surveillance and the body of knowledge it generates helps to fill in the gaps when police are kind of deemed illegitimate by the people who are being policed. And we see this continue to this day in Black and immigrant neighborhoods around the country, where, from ground to sky, automated license plate readers, CCTV cameras, and gunshot detection specifically targets communities where police are convinced that, if a gunshot were to sound, nobody would call the police, and surveillance kind of solves this technical problem for them. The great cultural historian Carlo Ginzburg once described early modern kind of inquisitors, like Spanish Inquisition, as anthropologists, because it was them in the course of interrogations that created the state's body of knowledge about religious and ethnic minorities. This knowledge was based and saw through the myopic lens of racial supremacy and oppression. We still see this dynamic at play when the LAPD, for instance, makes someone vulnerable to harassment and surveillance when they interpret a sports jersey or a specific color t-shirt as a gang signifier. It is that body of knowledge that they are creating through surveillance and interpreted through their own lens that becomes the state's body of knowledge when it comes to trying to understand and know a body of people. And so in this sense, we see the long legacy of surveillance and its use as an essential tool to understanding racialized communities, oppressing racialized communities that we still understand today and we still grapple with today. So I'll end my comments there for now.
Thank you so much. Professor Gordon?
Hi, good morning, everyone. Again, it's a real pleasure to be here with you today. Thank you so much for the invitation. And thank you to my co-panelists. I think I'll be able to potentially build a little bit on Professor Guariglia's comments. I don't necessarily consider myself to be a scholar of police surveillance technology specifically, but I am interested in the intersections between urban governance, policing modalities, and racial segregation. And as part of my research, I had the opportunity to conduct ride-alongs for over a year with police officers in different parts of a highly segregated city. So I could kind of look at some of these dynamics as they're playing out and some of the processes at the organizational level that are really driving kind of widening differences in the ways that different places and people are policed. So I want to call attention to a similar point that a critical consequence of policing and carcerality is in the process of is in the production of knowledge. So surveillance produces data, and this in turn often informs future systems of surveillance. And so we have this compounding process that has a long historical legacy, but that also finds kind of mutual reinforcement in routine policing practices. And the historical ties, I think my co-panelists have touched on really nicely, but the emergence of criminology as a field is deeply linked to the era of race science and eugenics. Scientists used racial statistics to justify ideas of racial hierarchy, systems of racial domination, and ideas of inherent inferiority and superiority over time. In my research, I look at the organizational processes within policing that produce this kind of data, and then the practices that respond to that. So I'm interested in kind of how contemporary patterns of over-surveillance in race-class subjugated communities emerge. And I look at policing through this case study of a segregated city. And I ask, how did police executives respond to this landscape and implement strategies that in turn kind of remake this landscape in its kind of material and symbolic qualities? And in some regards, I found things that we would largely expect. So neighborhoods that were predominantly Black and poorer were defined and framed by police executives as violent and criminal, and this was bolstered by the use of crime data and statistics. And then policing strategies in turn focus on suppressing crime. So in this case, the police department pursued a strategy of kind of very aggressive investigatory stops, so investigatory traffic stops and stop and frisk. They deployed officers that were defined as hotspots two areas defined as hotspots, and then they conducted a high number of stops of vehicles and pedestrians in search of contraband, like guns or drugs. And so, research on the effectiveness of this kind of hotspots policing is mixed, but it's important to note that this kind of proactive activity is really at the heart of a lot of racial profiling lawsuits. And there's ample evidence that these strategies play a critical role in souring police community relations. But moreover, these practices are a prime example of that kind of amplification of surveillance and criminalization. So the police are detecting more crime because they're ferreting it out through proactive stops. And this evidence of crime in turn justifies increasing deployments of proactive officers. And then just like one other thing that I think really emerged through my research, and might bear on this kind of thinking of surveillance as broadly construed. I think something that's often overlooked in discussions of urban policing is kind of the deeply relational nature of surveillance. So one of my key findings through this project was that the kind of central strategic narrative for the police department wasn't really actually around crime control in historically marginalized communities. It was actually around enhancing perceptions of safety and the economic value in areas like the city's downtown and its middle-class residential neighborhoods and gentrifying communities. So police executives are kind of preeminently concerned with providing responsive service and community problem solving in these kind of politically, economically, and racially dominant places. And this shapes their resource allocations and their administrative structures and other kinds of organizational decisions. So in terms of considering the impetus for surveillance, I think this points to some important dynamics. So like if particular kinds of communities or people are being labeled as criminal threats and subsequently surveilled and punished, like something is on the other side of that construction in need of protection. So how the police frame their role and function in predominantly white communities in economically advantaged neighborhoods is actually quite important to what they end up doing across the city. And I think this also encourages us to ask about the people and places that aren't subject to police surveillance and to kind of investigate the origins of those dynamics. So, how do the harms of white collar crime or, the kind of law violations of college students in the form of underage drinking or drug abuse or sexual violence come to be overlooked while the police agency targets its priorities to street crimes in predominantly Black and Latinx communities. And again, this is kind of tied to the relative standing of different parts of the city in the context of, in this case, kind of a post-industrial environment where economic revitalization is really seen as key to the city's survival. So yeah, I'll just end there by saying, that there's also a kind of surveillance element happening in those predominantly white areas, but it's different from what we typically think about. It's kind of more about keeping a watchful eye and being visible for those members of the community who want to see a visible police presence. And it's ultimately about the services that people want from the police, and this kind of protect and serve modality really relies on different policing tactics and technologies. But I want to suggest that, it's those kind of complicated connections between the uneven distribution of police service and surveillance and social control that are also really important to this question of how surveillance has evolved over time. So I'll end there.
Thank you so much, Professor Gordon. So I have an open question. So if there are participants who want to ask questions, I can see those and moderate those. So if you have questions from the audience, please feel free to put those in the Q&A and I can try to draw those to the attention of the panelists. You started the discussion for us, but I would invite you to give us a little more information or give us a little more thinking about what the impact historically has been of police surveillance tools in contributing to an unequal or segregated communities in our country, and how have race and class influenced or molded the government surveillance efforts? What's the interaction of those? Someone want to speak to that first?
So maybe I'll go first here and think about this for two perspectives, right? I've talked a little bit about my thinking on the topic of surveillance and race in the context of antebellum slavery, right? I think it's quite apparent, right, that during slavery, white society looked to free and enslaved Blacks to provide information on Black behavior in order to protect the interests of white society. And that includes, white slaveholders, but whites more broadly, right? Clearly the goal was to maintain the institution of slavery for as long as it served white society's interests, right? And this is the case certainly in the South or the Deep South, but also in the North, which I think often some people will overlook. So I think, right, that might be the, for me, right, the earliest and most striking use of surveillance, generally speaking, to contribute to segregation. Right, I think I would just want to point out maybe something more modern times, right, which is the government's mass incarceration of Black people, particularly Black male youth and young Black men from low-income communities, right? This phenomenon has relied extensively on surveillance, among other particular government practices, right? So mass incarceration and government endorsed snitching, if you will, are inextricably interlinked, right? Surveillance facilitates this pipeline of incarceration. And of course, incarceration is an ultimate form of segregation. So I think what you will find is that during this era of mass incarceration, many investigations and prosecutions rely on human surveillance, cooperators, right, who work with law enforcement. Right, these individuals are asked or strongly encouraged, coerced, if you like, to provide information about the alleged criminal activities of others in order to receive criminal leniency, right? So generally they're not receiving absolution or free pass, right? They are convicted, incarcerated, and sentenced, but their sentence is reduced. And this cooperator's information is in turn used to investigate and prosecute another individual who may or may not become a cooperator. So, right, we're beginning to see, I think, lots of themes, right, across each of our three comments, right, that surveillance, right, amplifies and compounds and contributes to a continuing and evolving sort of pipeline, whether it's information or the incarceration of bodies, what have you. But so this, what Professor Alexandra Natapov has called the snitching institution, which operates or is embedded within the criminal legal system, right, is not unlike traditional informer statutes. Individuals receive a reward for providing information, although the reward is not monetary. It is a system that is enshrined in law here in modern times as sentencing statutes, which specifically recognize a reduction in penalty for cooperation, and as well prosecution policies, which specifically also recognize and endorse this particular practice. It's different, of course, from informer statutes in that it is highly regulated, formalized, and government controlled, right? It's operating within our very modern criminal legal system. And so, to the question of, what's the impact of police surveillance tools or practices in contributing to unequal or segregated communities. I mean, I think we have the very obvious example of maintenance of slavery. We've got modern mass incarceration as well. And then I think I'll stop here.
Yeah, crime, I mean, police cannot police crime, right? Crime is an amorphous legal category. Crime is ephemeral. People break a window and then are gone. And so in lieu of being able to police and surveil crime, police have always had to police and surveil populations. And that relies on a decision of which populations are more predisposed to committing crimes. And so it begins from an inherent assumption of, a biological predisposition for crime and criminality. And then once that population is under enough surveillance, it is a self-fulfilling prophecy because crime exists everywhere. If you were to put, I think somebody like a white collar crime under the same level of surveillance that most people who live in border communities or in some neighborhoods of Atlanta or Chicago live in, they would find crime. And so as Professor Gordon was saying, this is about building not just it's about building a body of data that then can be re-legitimize the amount of policing and surveillance that racialized populations are already under. And it's, what we call tech washing, right? Is they say, how on earth could putting up all of these microphones that are supposed to be detecting gunshots. How on earth can that be racialized? This is just the neighborhood where we have heard the most gunshots. And that is because there is already the most amount of surveillance there. It is because they are listening with a biased ear, so that fireworks and car backfires to them are already assumed to be gunshots because of their internalized assumptions about a neighborhood. And so this creates a body of data which they believe is legitimate and is unbiased because it has been collected over time. And so surveillance is a key part of re-weaponizing these already biased and racialized assumptions that go back, well over a century.
And I'm happy to add kind of one final point to this, which is that as we're thinking about the relationship between surveillance and the kind of construction of unequal and segregated communities, so an important dynamic within this is not just, first, to Professor Dennis's point, I think, the relationship between mass incarceration and segregation and the way that mass incarceration is really kind of articulating the nature of particular kinds of urban spaces is fundamentally important. And then there's an additional dynamic of kind of regulating the boundaries between these places and the role that the police have played in determining who belongs, and the role that surveillance plays in not only, regulating different kinds of places, but regulating different kinds of people who encounter each other in the same place. So kind of the maintenance of segregation boundaries. And, another kind of contemporary example from my own research, I had the opportunity to shadow a traffic enforcement officer who worked in the downtown district of the city and whose car was automated with one of these automatic license plate reader systems, or an ALPR system. So, the system is reading the plates of passing vehicles and returning a notification if the plate is associated with a violation. And this could range from something like a suspended license to a stolen vehicle alert. And during this ride along, the officer actually drove outside of his district into a public housing unit where most of the residents were Black, and it was like almost adjacent to the current district in the downtown. And as he's driving down these blocks, the ALPR system is pinging almost constantly. And he showed me at the end of the ride that his car had scanned over 1,200 license plates that evening, and 83 vehicles had come back with suspended plates. And so, this is one of those technological tools that creates those feedback loops that amplifies racial and economic inequalities. Sociologist Sarah Brain really describes this in her work. And in the state where I conducted this research, over 60% of license suspensions were for failure to pay forfeitures rather than for traffic violations. So in this moment of, in the situation of overlapping kind of dynamics of poverty and race, like license suspensions are concentrated in predominantly Black lower income areas. But then when people driving those vehicles cross segregation boundaries into this downtown district where this automatic license plate reader system is kind of patrolling the streets, they're then subject to further enforcement. And so we can see this mechanism that potentially amplifies surveillance, but then that can also play a role in kind of deterring people from crossing segregation boundaries because of those enhanced risks of surveillance and further punishment.
So can I just add a little sort of brief side commentary, which I think is interesting and amplifies this concept of the choice of government to implement certain surveillance modalities in different jurisdictions. And this Matthew's comments lead me to think about this. So I spent most of my life growing up and working in the DC metro area, DC, Virginia, Maryland, areas. And this is an area which has ShotSpotter, at least in DC, has ShotSpotter, where you put these microphones on buildings to detect gunshots. And so, I have now been in Athens, Georgia for over 10 years. And down here, I will say that I have heard in my time far more what could be gunshots, right, in this rural community that many people embrace firearms and weapons. So I have heard many more gunshots and or fireworks, right, and throughout the course of the year. So I would say, like, if I were in DC or Maryland, I might hear them, if I was in the region and there was a shooting, but right, sort of around like New Year's and sort of very limited time frames. But down here, I hear them, for lots of different events. Someone told me, I'm not from here, but a wedding celebration is a good time to fire off your weapon, right? And I was like, really? Okay. But a football game or, just because is a good time to either fire off your weapon or use fireworks. And so it's interesting to think about. I'm 99% sure there's no shot spotter here in Athens, Georgia, but I do know that on social platforms now where people share information, they're sort of like, did you hear that? Did you hear that? Was that a firework or was that gunshot? But so it's interesting to think about when government, right, uses certain modalities, when individuals now have the ability to use certain surveillance modalities and what happens, right? So I'm sorry if I didn't say it was apparent, right? This area that I live in now is predominantly white. DC metro area is very multiracial, multi-ethnic, many different socioeconomic statuses. So I just thought that's sort of an interesting side note. It's not research, but it is, I think, experientially based, valid evidence.
Thank you. It seems to me there are two different stories we could tell ourselves about surveillance. One is a story where surveillance has developed over time and it's been well-intentioned, but it has had the sort of unforeseen consequences that you just spoke to us about. Or we could also tell ourselves a story where the consequences themselves, particularly along racial lines, were either the purpose or were fully intended. Help us think about which of these stories might reflect the reality as you understand it from your work. Does anybody want to take that first?
Should I? Maybe? Okay. I can. So, I think, speaking to the language of the question, I think that we should understand the consequences, especially the racial or ethnic consequences or the socioeconomic status as fully well-intended for the reasons that have been mentioned by Professor Gordon and Mr. Guariglia, right? Whether it's the collection of information about particular groups that would otherwise be opaque to the government, whether that also extends to surveillance, to control and or the ability to capitalize on their resources or labor. I think, again, we saw this during antebellum slavery. We see it in mass incarceration. I can add, and I think maybe it's particularly appropriate today, we could think about during the civil rights movement and Black Power movements of the 50s through the 70s, right? And the J. Edgar Hoover's FBI, right, created what is, right, commonly called COINTELPRO, right, the counterintelligence program, which was specifically aimed at surveilling and infiltrating and undermining and extinguishing civil rights and Black Power movements and related organizations or individuals, right? So well-known targets, of course, include the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We could add Malcolm X, Huey Newton, Fred Hampton, as individuals that people are commonly familiar with having been targeted by the government. We could think about organizations such as the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, right? The Black Panther Party, the Revolutionary Action Movement, the Black Liberation Army, the American Indian Armory, the Puerto Rican Socialists, right? All of these variety of groups who potentially could undermine the government's interest and presumably, therefore, white society's interests. I think, right, that's another explicit example of surveillance, mostly but not expressly based on race or ethnicity or political beliefs, right? There were certainly whites and white organizations who would have been aligned with many of these individuals or other organizations who were also surveilled. But again, viewed as undermining government interest or larger white society's interest. And so, right, the FBI collected this information to foment dissent, to engage in blackmail and coercion, to police and prosecute many individuals. So I think, I think we just have many express or obvious instances of the use of surveillance as a means of racial control and capitalizing on racial or ethnic resources, that it's hard to deny that it's fully intended. And as we've heard, there are so many other less apparent, but equally powerful instances of that. And so I'll stop there.
I can, I'll add a quick comment, kind of building off of some of those ideas that Professor Dennis shared about the intentionality of surveillance and how intentional it really is. One of the things that I found in my research is that sometimes, like, how we trace those pathways between that intentionality and some of the outcomes we see is more challenging in this kind of era of community-based policing, problem-oriented policing, and so it can seem as though some of these reform efforts are truly a reflection of kind of well-intentioned police administrators really trying to respond to the needs and interests of communities and repair some of those historically fraught relations or engage in kind of racial redress. One of the things, again, just with that focus on like, what are the actual kind of like interests or and alignments going on here? I think when we envision community policing, one of the risks that we see is the kind of expansion of state power and surveillance, like within historically race class subjugated communities. But on the other side of that coin is kind of the use of community policing to kind of expand state power within dominant communities, predominantly white communities, like economically powerful communities, to like really make the state a collaborator in some of these projects that are around kind of bolstering economic value and protecting particular areas from encroachment by outsiders. And so, in this case that I looked at, like it kind of began with a redistricting reform that aligned police district boundaries with racial segregation boundaries. And the surprising thing was that stakeholders from across the city, all kinds of different neighborhoods, really bought into this because it was rooted in that logic of tailoring policing to the needs of particular places. So it seemed to have that capacity for like a more democratic community control over what the police do in different kinds of communities. And then when the kind of subsequent strategies really ended up amplifying some of the kind of race and class inequalities of segregation and in policing outcomes, it really seemed like, oh, maybe this was an unintended consequence of these place-specific strategies. But the narrative that really focused policing priorities on the interests and needs of the city's kind of political economic elite, like that was intentional from the outset. But I think that kind of intentionality can occasionally be overlooked. So to your question, Kim, sometimes it's hard to kind of disambiguate, but as we compare these two narratives, we can kind of really look at like what are the underlying logics and whose interests are they serving. And sometimes it's much more overt than we would expect that police executives are kind of aligning their priorities with the interests of powerful white stakeholders in cities.
Thank you. There's a question in the chat about constitutionality, and maybe I'll broaden that a little bit by inviting you to say how people have sort of either fought back against these surveillances historically or challenged them or evaded them, or what are the ways in which we've seen resistance to the kinds of surveillance that you're speaking to.
I guess I'll start this one. I mean, resistance to surveillance is as old as surveillance itself. And I mean, in my research, if you looked at like kind of immigrant communities in New York, I mean, leaning into the things that made a person anonymous to the state. So disappearing into very crowded city blocks or alleyways that were unintelligible to police, reverting to your native language, which police could not understand, was one way to do that. But there have been, legal battles against surveillance as well. I mean, one of the things that, is a very interesting kind of ethical and legal precursor to the arguments we're having now about face recognition is, there was a huge legal battle and a lot of bills that were in privacy bills introduced on the floors of state houses in the early 20th century about the use of the rogues gallery and mugshots, early mugshots in the early 20th century, in the sense that people felt wronged by police departments where if they were arrested and then acquitted or let go without being charged, their mugshots still stayed, their files, their fingerprints still stayed in police filing cabinets. And they thought that was a real harm being done to their reputation and to their presumption of innocence. And so there was a huge legal battle in the early 20th century to expunge these records. And the retention of biometric information and the retention of police files, whether or not it's accessible on Google, people can see your arrest record and mugshot, or whether or not it's just retained by police departments in the form of large face recognition databases, it is still something we're struggling with. And I see less legal battles against that now, in terms of people's Fourth Amendment rights over the privacy of their face, but people are now across the country passing, over a dozen cities passing ordinances that prevent the use of face recognition by police or prevent the collection of biometric information without consent. So there is a growing movement based on these ethical and legal concerns that is growing.
So I think as to specifically the legal question, in particular, a due process 14th Amendment challenge, I think some of the difficulty and what would explain what Dr. Guariglia said about moving towards sort of community action to change laws or enact particular laws, and other types of challenges, privacy challenges, is that 14th Amendment due process and anti-discrimination is such a hard claim to prevail upon. Certainly in terms of direct express discrimination, right? As we've talked about, it might be quite hard to get that kind of data or information that would support that claim, and disparate impact claims, the standard is so difficult. So I think for these reasons, as Dr. Guariglia mentioned, you're going to see other types of challenges, which may embrace racial or ethnic or socioeconomic aspects, but which are centered on some other legal premise. I think to the broader question of other means of resistance, I love the examples given by Dr. Guariglia, reverting to native language. If I think about antebellum slavery, there was the use of coded music or song or language that whites would not be able to understand, right? So whether it was singing a slave spiritual, that would transmit coded messages about maybe a work slowdown or facilitating an escape or an illicit meetup, or whether it was reverting to native languages, native African languages, or some other newly developed dialect was used. Operating under the cover of night, which is similar to disappearing into crowds or unfamiliar geography, right? So there were what were called midnight schools. So those who were enslaved were prohibited from possessing written materials and learning or being taught to read and write. And so they would literally around midnight go out into the woods or some other hidden space to study stolen information. Obviously, if you were escaping at night, right, you're less likely to be noticed. You might be harder to track. So again, the same sorts of mechanisms that were used in the past or used now. I think the other is maintaining close confidence or being unwilling to reveal information to other individuals and certainly to government officials, right? So Nat Turner's rebellion in Southampton, Virginia, 1831 was maybe the most successful rebellion, so to speak, but Nat Turner told only maybe 4 to 7 other men about his plans, and anyone who agreed to be involved knew very few organizing details. So I think this unwillingness to share information with others or with the government is obviously another means of resistance, which we see in the past and we see still today.
I'll add one kind of final idea to this kind of broader question of the consequences of avoidance and the potentials of resistance. So to kind of that first part about the consequences of avoidance, social scientists have really kind of looked at the relationship between surveillance and system avoidance. So people who are vulnerable to arrest because of past contact with the criminal justice system or because of their citizenship status or other concerns, will actively avoid future interactions with the police. And like one of the consequences of this is that it's like another emergent inequality in the service that people have access to, in part because the police are kind of frontline emergency responders, and that's a reflection of how cities have chosen to address kind of pressing social problems. But this kind of avoidance also kind of extends to systems beyond policing. So again, Sarah Brain's work on surveillance has found that people who have contact with the criminal justice system may avoid other kinds of institutions that keep formal records, like medical, financial, labor market, educational institutions. And this again has real consequences for inequality, just in terms of unequal access to services, not just police services, but all kinds of institutional resources. So that's kind of on the hazards of avoidance. But in terms of like the potentials of resistance, and I think my co-panelists have really tapped into this. I think like the efforts that we see to address harms outside of the state are also these arenas where communities have really envisioned new systems of accountability and repair that don't rely on the police, that like don't rely on punishment in the same way. And so the long history of kind of community-led justice that is trying to do that preventive and responsive work that will really like reduce harm in communities by making sure that people's basic material needs are met, and that there are kind of processes in place that focus on centering harm repair for survivors and accountability for perpetrators. Like these kinds of movements I think are particularly kind of important and exciting to like remember and explore as we kind of we're in this moment where we're kind of all broadly considering like alternatives to policing. So what exists outside of the state that communities have created already.
Thank you. There's an invitation from one of the questions to speak to what Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy is in the context of police surveillance. So do you have thoughts on that specifically given the holiday today?
So I think, right, there's a saying that, right, you don't write your own legacy, your legacy is written by others about you, right? And so I think here, right, I don't know that he himself in particular maybe spoke to this. I don't know, I'm obviously imagining what I think he might have been thinking about, but I think, right, his legacy is certainly one of, right, we think about COINTELPRO and the government's particular effort, right, to use surveillance, human surveillance, and at the time, or what was at the time, the current state-of-the-art technology at the time, right, recordings, wiretaps, sending you messages, right. He is a particular exemplar of how the government has used the modalities available to it at the time, and how particularly willing the government is to target individuals with particular motivations. Now, I mean, the argument, to me, it's hard to argue about, how much criminality Martin Luther King Jr. was engaged in. I'm sure, right, like most of us, he's violating some criminal law somewhere at some time. Some of them more serious than others, but right, I don't think we would characterize him as a criminal, right? And he was not, right, he wasn't residing in or living in what I think would be necessarily characterized as high crime areas. And so, right, I just think he becomes an example specifically of what the government's ability and intention and the lengths to which it will go in using police-backed surveillance. And so I think he's just an example and a reminder as we move into this modern era, more modern era of what can happen and what can be done if unchecked, right? If unregulated, if there's no accountability for what is happening.
Yeah, I mean, I think the relationship between Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and surveillance in general is that the state has always been committed to undermining the Black freedom struggle, and has done so at the expense of shifting its surveillance attentions elsewhere. Like we said, that surveillance has been concentrated around some groups and not others. And a very useful way that has been done this is the myth of the outside agitator, which is, communists had infiltrated Black labor unions in Alabama in the 1930s, or in this case that, communists were pulling the strings behind the civil rights movement. That the calculus that the state has had to go through to make the Black freedom struggle and struggle for kind of racial and economic justice a national security threat is always been made behind the scenes, and is done to direct surveillance in certain directions and not others. And the other one is that, Professor Dennis is absolutely right that, to some extent, it wasn't about the criminality of Martin Luther King, but it was about weaponizing information about his personal life, is what the FBI was collecting. And it's about, how surveillance, even when a person thinks they're not committing crimes, that the type of information that can be collected by the state and can be weaponized can still be incredibly hurtful and can hurt a person very badly, even if the information they're collecting is not of a criminal nature. That the information that is being collected by the state is very easily weaponized, even for people who don't necessarily think they have kind of criminality to hide.
So there were a couple questions here in the chat about sort of public-private partnerships and emerging technologies that I thought I had a couple of thoughts on that I wanted to share. I don't mean to hijack your function, Professor Thomas, but
That's great. That's where I was going next. So you're right there.
And so I thought one sort of historical point that moves into the modern that's important to think about if you're not familiar with it is thinking about California gang databases, right? These first began very low tech in about the 1970s in LA. I think I've got my time correct, right? When officers, during traffic stops would write down information on index cards, what were called field identification cards. And these cards were then kept in large archival systems, not unlike a library card catalog system. And so they would write down, the individual's or suspect's name, any identifying information, and information that the officer thought pertained to gang membership or gang affiliation. And so later, LA developed this into some sort of electronic system called GREAT, the Gang Reporting Evaluation and Tracking System. So officers could look through the hard files, the hard index cards, or they could search this electronic database, which again, wasn't necessarily easy or efficient. Fast forward to today, and California uses what's called CalGang. The first prototype for this was developed in 1996, I think, for San Diego. CalGang is a privately created digital, electronic, searchable, analyzable, right, database. So it's privately developed, but it's used by law enforcement throughout California. And it also, in its most modern incarnation, can incorporate or consider other technologies, so body camera videos and facial recognition. And of course, the information that's obtained from this database can be compared or cross-referenced with other databases, right? Professor Gordon mentioned, like, there are other government agencies which maintain their own databases. And so I think this is an interesting example of sort of the historical, right, movement from a very low-tech system of trying to identify alleged gang affiliations. There's lots of connections here to space and place, the development of gangs in particular in California, but now we see this more broadly. And the movement over time from a public effort to a private effort, and now there's a public-private, right, connection here, and the growth of the technology and the use of technology. California was at the forefront of this, but many states and police agencies today have similar databases, whether large scale and computer-based or more informal and internal. But the concerning thing about this is that the information is very closely guarded by the private entity, by police, by prosecutors. Many people aren't aware that these databases even exist, the robustness of them, the information that's in them, whether the individual is in them, right? In 2016, a California state auditor concluded that with respect to Cow Gang, there were many errors in the database, including individuals included in the database as a result of false information entered by law enforcement, which knowingly false information entered by law enforcement. And there were individuals in there that defied absolute logic. So there was a toddler, I forget their age, was it 2 or 3? How could a toddler possibly be affiliated with a gang? Knowingly, right? Whatever. And most people didn't know they were in the database, and there was no means to remove your name from the database. And so I think this is an interesting example that addresses some of these questions. And where initially the databases were used to just sort of identify alleged gangs or gang members, they're now used to monitor and investigate individuals in groups and communities and neighborhoods. They're used for prosecution. They're used to harshly sentence individuals. And, you know, I'm quite sure this is, there is a connection now to modern surveillance. So, right, facial recognition systems, other shared criminal databases, you know, algorithms. But again, it's also hard to know because the information is so closely guarded. We can't know what's going on with them. So, and I will say that, for example, also there's a question of using information from Amazon Ring and other, you know, neighborhood apps and so on, right? To what extent is government amassing all this information and using it collectively? So I can stop there.
One of the fascinating things about a lot of this technology is that it is taking spaces that were historically known for being more nurturing to privacy, right? You move out of the city so that there aren't so many prying eyes on you, so that there isn't a police officer on every single corner. And the fear of racialized crime has become so weaponized and so dispersed through media, through, you know, police actually going door to door telling people they should buy security cameras for their homes, that it's actually turning these areas that were once known for being nurturing of privacy into kind of surveillance havens for the purpose of kind of digital gatekeeping. That it is taking public neighborhoods and you know, quiet suburbs and turning them into de facto private and gated communities by virtue of all of this surveillance that people are going up. And to some extent, it's because of all this like dispersed racialized fear that's happening. It's kind of, there's kind of a crime panic happening right now. But to some extent also, this is the result of huge multi-million-dollar tech companies that have very good marketing departments. That are dispatching marketing people to homeowners associations saying like, you don't have automated license plate readers yet, we can sell you this very easy to use cameras that put up, you know, a centralized computer will get alerts whenever somebody you've hotlisted enters the neighborhood that you don't want there. You know, and to some extent they're deputizing police to do this for them. With Amazon Ring, you know, we did this big investigation with LAPD where they were giving LAPD discount codes where people who use your code to buy cameras, you will get a kickback. And so the LAPD were going out and dispersing their code to people, asking them to buy security cameras. And all these people were like, well, wait, I live in a safe neighborhood. Do I really need a surveillance camera? But when a cop comes and knocks on the door and says like, listen, you really need a surveillance camera. What person who does not want their stuff to be stolen is going to say no? And so, you know, to some extent, yeah, the racialized crime panic is ongoing. You know, there is hardly a point of the 20th century where some of this did not exist. But to some extent, we've never seen it so corporatized and the profit motive so big for spreading that kind of racialized fear and for dispersing these kind of public-private surveillance partnerships. So I think to some extent, it's old hat, but I think there is a component of this that is very new and kind of troubling.
I think I have to wrap up. So thank you so much to our three panelists. This has been so informative and insightful and gives us lots of questions to continue on thinking about and pondering later this week. And so I really feel like you've set the framework for us to understand this issue. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And thank you to the Journal for working with this panel and this fantastic symposium.
Yes, thank you to all of our panelists. And we had over 70 attendees today, so that was really exciting. For anyone interested in attending our panels throughout the week, and tomorrow we'll be beginning our conversations with kind of looking at how police surveillance technologies have expanded, all the way into Friday, talking about reforms and abolitionist approaches to police surveillance technologies. So we're really excited for the rest of the week. And thank you so much again to all our panelists and our moderator for helping out today. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.